there is no question that once you impose a change in the limit or a change in legislation, it will inevitably will affect some farmers. But what we don't want is that farmers react to the headline rather than reacting to their own analysis of their own situation. That's the key point.
Welcome to AgriFocus with myself, Stella Meehan, and I'm joined in studio today by Head of Dairy Knowledge Transfer with Teagasc, Dr. Patton, to talk about all things nitrates. So first of all, Joe, let's start off with deadlines. The European Commission has decided that by January 1st of 2024, which is not too far away now at this stage, that some farmers across the country have to reduce the rate of organic manure nitrogen from 250 kilos to 220. So that's kind of just around the corner now. And have ye determined in Teagasc how many are affected by this, we'll say, in the short term?
Yeah, in the short term, Stella, there's up to a couple of thousand people will be affected in the short term, okay? Which is very variable. Some counties have only one person affected. Some counties have hundreds affected. So there's very much a geographical bias on that. Now, we should say also that when we say affected, of that couple of thousand farms, there could be a good chunk of those that the effect is relatively modest or relatively moderate. They're technically in the zone where they need to change something, but the changes might be, as simple as maybe an adjustment to the amount of slurry exported, or an adjustment maybe to stock numbers and young stock, or whatever it might be. Then we move in further into the idea then of farms that have a significant effect, and we'd be estimating those. It's difficult to say because we don't know the options. We'll never know the options available to all these farms until we sit down and do a plan with them. But certainly in the hundreds of farms then that would have significant decisions to make. And obviously then we have a smaller cohort again that, they have a significant issue to deal with on farms. But again, we have to see what's available to those farms first before we can say, what the scale or what the best option is. So really, that's the sort of the breakdown of it. A couple of thousand overall. A good chunk of those, it'll be a tweak. We'll do them, and then the other bunch with bigger decisions to make, I would say.
And are there various factors in those decisions in the sense of the actual farm enterprise itself or the geographical location?
Yeah, I think it depends on the farm circumstances, really. So, you do have situations, for example, where a farm might be pushing towards the existing limit, or even over the existing limit, and possibly using something like slurry export to stay under the existing limit. And they may or may not have access to additional land. They may have access in a way that they're purchasing forage from additional land or whatever it might be. Some of those farms have come to us and said, look, their priority is to normalize the arrangements with the landowners that they're using for maybe importing feed from, for example. That exercise on paper can solve a problem very quickly for those type of farms, but that option is not available to everybody. And obviously, as we say, there's quite a geographical bias or difference in it. So what we tend to see is that obviously in areas where there's an issue, we tend to have lots of farms in that area possibly that have an issue. So they're possibly all chasing a similar resource around land. So land is not going to be the answer for everybody because this tends to be a very regionalized thing. And certain regions, we have big numbers of farmers together in an area facing the same problem at the same time. That becomes, that the easy out, if you like, of additional land might be just as available to them as everywhere else,
So we're looking at the options, I suppose, are exporting slurry, getting more land, culling cows. You haven't mentioned it there, I suppose, and I don't know how close some farmers are, or maybe none at all, but I suppose it is an option.
Yeah, it's an option. And look, we have to be careful on this. And I think, I would be guarding against cheap headlines around this kind of stuff. There's a bit of stuff in media about a bit of sensationalism around this kind of thing that doesn't serve anybody well at all, I would say. So we have to be careful in what we say around the question on reduction of herd numbers. It's rationalizing the herd to, if the situation is that the herd or that the particular farm in question has a situation where they're already reliant on purchased feed, they're already reliant on buying silage or maize or whatever it might be on the stem. They're reliant already on export and slurry, and that they're doing that in a way that's quite marginal or quite low margin, I should say, from their own perspective. In a situation like that, particularly also maybe if there's a labour issue on the farm, we have said in this, and we've been consistent on this for 10, 15 years before there was any talk of changes to nitrates. Those farms need to make a decision, and maybe make a decision based on good numbers. And in some cases, a trim in stock numbers might actually be beneficial to them. Okay, that's really an economics question as much as it is a nitrates question. On the other hand, we have other farms then that won't be an option because they've already got to the situation where the farm is in balance for feed. Now, more or less, the two things are related, but they're also separate. I think it's not every farm that's going to say, right, changing stock numbers is the solution. And I would say particularly where farms are just moderately into exceeding the 220 limit now, in that case, generally speaking, it's not going to be changing stock numbers. Possibly it's going to be the solution. Maybe when you're closer to the 250 and over, some element of a look at the stock numbers relative to land availability, to land structure would be the thing. But we have to be clear that's a case by case thing, and it's more really about, and this is maybe where we need to be careful. That situation or that question is more about the intensity rather than the scale or the numbers. We have to separate the idea of scale and intensity from each other. Like, it is possible, theoretically anyway, it is possible for the dairy industry in Ireland to become less intensive but grow at the same time.
But also, I suppose it has to be for each individual farmer to maintain their revenues. At the end of the day, we were speaking throughout the ploughing and we were doing the live stream and we had like a dairy panel on, and there was one very articulate, I felt anyways, a dairy farmer who he was doing everything right. I mean, you could literally put picture perfect idea of, and he had a moderate farm. It wasn't very big, and he had literally no choice. He couldn't think of any other way. He was doing everything that he could to try and stay within the legislation, but it was looking like, and he said that culling some of his cows or getting rid of them was just going to have a massive impact. And his business plan, which he had made, for a 5-year business plan, was just out the window now. It just wasn't viable because of these restrictions. And it is a bit, not to bring the emotion into it, but that's heartbreaking for someone who does want to make a viable income. It is, but
I also think that, while that's a story, and I sympathise fully with this, with the story and the sentiment behind it, and of course people have made their own call on that. We have to be careful though that other people don't listen to that and think that directly applies to them. Okay, because if you make your decisions based on the headline, or you make your decisions based on the particular circumstance that somebody else is facing, you may not make the right decision for yourself. I've spoken to lots of groups and lots of farmers over groups in the last couple of months, and like that, actually quite recently in County Meath, actually we had a very good meeting on a lot of this, and somebody came to me after the meeting and said, we were reassured after listening to the fact that we should look at our own numbers. And they did go and look at their own numbers and said, this is not as big a deal for me as I thought it was. There's lots of people in that situation. Now, that doesn't solve the problem of the chap that you spoke about who has to face his own situation. But it comes down to the individual and what they need to do individually themselves. It's a very difficult thing to give headline advice to, in a general sense, without having the situation in front of you, without having the figures in front of you, to be able to say what an individual needs to do. But we can't emphasize that enough. We have to be looking at it that farmers individually will make their own decisions. There is no question that once you impose a change in a limit or a change in legislation, it will inevitably will affect some farmers. But what we don't want is that farmers react to the headline rather than reacting to their own analysis of their own situation. That's the key point.
And getting that advice, I suppose, is important. So how has Teagasc adapted the advice to dairy farmers, particularly in the last couple of months?
Yeah, well, we've done quite a bit with this, and funny, lately, actually, over the last week or so, we met again with our dairy advisors. We brought our dairy advisors to 2 locations, north and south. And we spent the whole day from early morning right through looking at case studies. What will we do here? What will we do in this situation? How will we get around this? How would we, deal with the issue? Now, I should say in all this thing too, Stella, and be clear on this, from a Teagasc perspective, we have in the background to all this the ambition that we can put advice on farms that can help farms maintain, protect and improve water quality as well. This is not just moving numbers on a page to sort of circumvent the regulation. That is part of it too. And, issues around slurry storage and all those things and adherence to good farming practice underpins a lot of what we've talked about. But anyway, on the point of the changes that would be made, like we met with our advisors, about 80 people overall, and we had great feedback from them in that when they have laid out the potential and the decisions for people, the number of farms that they're dealing with that have to have some genuine concern or real issue to deal with is smaller maybe than would have first perceived. But those farms do have a big issue that has to be dealt with. And I would prefer to see the effort being made, not that we sort of panic everybody into a low level inaction on the thing, but that the people that really need help can be identified properly and more intensive advice go to them, because they're the ones who obviously need it. And we had a very good discussion. And look, we've said, like, based on numbers of case studies and numbers of interactions with advisors and groups, like, obviously people first of all will say, land is the first thing they want to do. Land is to maintain what they have. An issue, and it was a very good point that somebody made, a senior advisor made it, that really when we think about it, the price of land has gone up, people say, on the basis of derogation changes, but actually in reality the price of land should come down. It should come down significantly, actually, because land in a few years' time will not have the same stock carrying capacity that it used to have. So therefore, it cannot generate the same income that it used to. So therefore, in a way, dairy farmers should be paying less for land rather than paying more. So the long-term effect, actually, of changes to derogation rules, possibly the logical thing would be that the price of land should fall over time.
Well, I very much, that's a very valid point, but that is a longer term view, I suppose. And when you're going to the bank, looking for a loan to get extra land, you can't go to them. Well, in the long term, I'll be able to pay you back.
I get that, but no, what I mean is,
but it is a very valid point.
What I'm trying to get at here is that panicky decisions around rent and land without doing any analysis of what you need, it's not serving anybody except, it's not serving anybody at all, really, in from a dairy farmer's perspective. So we've talked through the land question. We've done the figures on what people could afford to pay for land, which I'm not going to tell you what answer we came up with. But it varies. It totally varies, actually, depending on the situation. Because if somebody has poor performing herd, and the profitability per cow is low, you'd be surprised at how little people can afford to pay for land. On the other hand, somebody that's performing quite well, they could afford to pay a little bit more, but not by as much as you think. That's up to the individual to make that decision for themselves. Really, one of the big ones, and it surprised us actually when we looked through it, young stock is an issue on farms. And surprisingly so, there's about 70% of young stock of heifers are calving at 2-year-olds, 30% aren't. Those are all an inventory cost to nitrates in the background. The number of young stock reared and the number of dry stock reared on farms is higher than what you would expect when you look at the figures. So, like, when we talk about stock numbers being rationalised or stock numbers being trimmed on farms, we shouldn't immediately think of the milking cow being the thing that gets first attention. Really, the dry cows, for example, or the more marginal animals, or the non-productive stock, or maybe the replacement rate and all these things, and suddenly weighing heifers becomes a very important thing, because if you can get your heifers calved at 2-year-old on target, and you don't have a whole batch that's calving at 2.5, that has its benefits anyway, but it has actually suddenly starts to have a big effect on nitrates. So go back and look at the stock inventory on a farm, and I'd challenge anyone to say that they couldn't find 5, 6, 7% of the animals on the farm that are not currently maybe paying their way. you move them off, and then you can retain your cow numbers quite well. So there's lots of things there's a lot of nuance in this, and it's more than just a headline, I would say.
And just one of the details, I suppose, would be some farm organisations, most recently the ICSA, has made calls for the nitrates figures to be updated on a weekly basis so that farmers can have an idea of their farm level. So do you see farmers struggling with this at the minute?
I see farmers struggling with some delays and some changes. And I think, to be fair, from a Teagasc perspective, we are in the position of having to utilise those figures to help farmers make decisions. The decisions around how those figures are presented and the frequency and all that, that's really a Department of Agriculture decision or a Department of Agriculture issue, I would say. But like in principle, up to date on real time data is the important thing. And the more we have that, the better, I would say. But as I say, look, we have our contact with the Department of Ag as well, and they've had their own issues to sort out and their own genuine issues to sort out, and they've been working their way through those as well. I think it's really a question for the department, to be honest. But, anything that gives, real-time data is a good thing. But then the challenge becomes to farmers then to use that data, because there's lots and lots of data platforms out there. We have to make sure they're being used. But it's a genuine point. We can't expect people to make good decisions with just an occasional view of where the nitrates are at. But look, as I say, the department, and they've been very positive in terms of their moves to try and improve that situation. But as I say, that's really a department issue rather than a Teagasc one, I would say.
And not to put another department issue at your doorstep, Joe, but it might be more so, I suppose, your expertise, in particular your expertise. You have your knowledge transfer expertise in Teagasc and your own doctorate. In terms of slurry testing, this is something that I've been chatting to Brian McDonald here in Agriland about regularly. And would you say that it needs to be reviewed? Because it went from 5 kilos down to 2.4 now, I think, per tonne. And in other words, like, farmers have to export twice as much now as they did in the past. So is that something maybe that needs a bit more research?
It is, I would say. Funny you should ask that question. I was on the phone yesterday to a farmer from up the country a bit, and very strong views on this, and we listened closely to what he said and made a lot of good points. And this was one of the big issues, or one of the big bugbears, actually. And funny to say, Stella, in his situation, just particular to this particular gentleman that we spoke to, that issue was a bigger issue almost for him than the change from 250 to 220, because it had such an effect on the scale and the volume of slurry to be moved off the farm. There is more research needed, and there is research underway. I know Pat Toohey in Moore Park is looking at volumes of slurry produced is one thing, and the testing and the intensity, I suppose, the nutrient content, from 5 back to 2.6, 2.7. That's one change. But these things are subject to review. And I suppose it's an important point we make, that in anything, even and we'll stick on the slurry question, but just for illustration, like we talk about, the nitrogen excretion rates of livestock, for example, that changed recently. That's all of these figures will be subject to constant review, and they'll be constantly reviewed through updated research or updated monitoring and research work. So, it's probably a source of frustration for farmers, and it's a source of frustration for advisors too, that just when you get to know the figure changes. But that's it's kind of the nature of the game we're in, that there's always a tweak to be made. That's not a tweak, that's a significant change from 5 back to 2.4. We are looking at that. It's something that Teagasc are looking at, and trying to not only look at the total amount or the total nutrient content, but I think one of the things, and it causes a bit of confusion, I had to get my own head around it for a while there, is that the pattern of nitrogen excretion might differ depending on the time of year. So, for example, the nitrogen excretion rate of a dry cow inside on 12% crude protein silage will be different than the nitrogen excretion rate of a cow that's in milk, producing 30 kilos of milk on a couple of kilos of concentrate plus high protein grass. So when we talk about this, for example, a cow that's at 106 106 divided by 52 would give you a figure. And why does that not translate? There is a slight difference in how there's a pattern effect of how the nitrogen is produced. Now, not every farm is going to fit in to that standard pattern. And then the farms that are outside that standard pattern have a genuine question. Why are we being shoehorned, for example, into this particular set of figures? But look, we need a figure that approaches where we at for the average. And that work is ongoing. And it is something we're very conscious of, because when we think about it, the excretion rates and the export rates and all those things, they all should sort of add up to 100, or when you subtract them, they should all add up to 0, really, because it's slurry versus stock numbers versus fields, and it all should match up. So there is an issue to be dealt with there. But I would say that, Pat's work is it's into the second year now, looking at volumes of slurry produced. To be fair to Pat, he's holding those numbers until he gets a good set of data together. But the initial results would show that there are changes to the standard figures have to be debated and have to be looked at. There's no doubt about that. But it's kind of watch this space for the moment on that.
Absolutely. And with the whole nitrates derogation, you mentioned there at the very start of the podcast, Joe, that it's essentially about the environment. I mean, farmers might crib that they have to do various things, but at the same time, I think that there's an awful criticism of dairy farmers as well, that people are saying, oh, big bucks dairy farmers don't want to cut their herd and stuff like that. And I think from what I gather, and I know a good many dairy farmers, I think they're holding their hands up and going, in fairness, we get it. Like, the maps are there, the EPA sees the water. Like, no one wants to pollute the nature. No one wants to pollute their local river by any means. Like, I don't know if that's what you're getting back in the feedback, or are you just getting farmers complaining? But I see more of an onus on farmers going, yeah, no, fair enough. Like, we do want to improve the water quality.
Yeah, look, that is true. But I think on that question, there has never been, well, I would say that the great majority of the farming population, and I think we have to be careful here as well to say that, it's not just derogation farmers and it's not just derogation dairy farmers that have a responsibility to water quality, right? That we see issues around respecting the margins, respecting the slurry spreading dates and the close periods. Are we really saying that it's only derogation farmers, that of those small percentage of farmers who spread outside the line, let's say, are they all derogation dairy farmers? I wouldn't think so. I think there's plenty of farmers across the board that have to look at their practices. Some of the derogation farmers that I would visit, they have done more in terms of setting up their infrastructure and setting up their system to protect water quality and protect environment than anybody has. They've been first on the train with correct amount of slurry storage. They have put their system in place for soil water. They're first in line for protected urea before it was something that was mandated, or before it was something that was maybe proven in field conditions. They were the farmers that went out and did it. There's people that have put their hand up to put in clover onto their farms. They've put up their hand around using high dairy beef genetics. All of those issues that can affect water quality, emissions, the whole issue of gaseous emissions or greenhouse gas emissions as well. So, I think we have to be careful and say that, derogation dairy farmers have done a huge amount and have been at the front, I would say, of getting technologies onto farms that can make a difference. So there is genuine. I think that we have, that the frustration that you hear from farmers and that boils over into that sort of exasperation you hear at meetings is not as much to do with the fact that there's, for want of a better term, that somebody's putting an end to their gallop. It's not that at all. I think maybe the bigger issue is there's a genuine frustration around rules that always seem to change or goalposts that always seem to move. That's where the frustration. The frustration is not that, suddenly we have to protect the environment and we don't want to do it. The frustration is more around the detail of what it is they're being asked to do, and maybe, to understand why those things have been brought in the first place. Now, the changes made and everything that has to happen from a legislative point of view, we have to look at it on the basis of, will it have a marked and genuine effect on the environmental issue that you're trying to solve. So water quality, for example. The EPA data is there, and it shows that the data essentially shows that water quality at an average level is stable. It has been stable for 10, 15 years now. It's a very convenient narrative to say that extra cow numbers in the country equals a big decline in water quality. The data doesn't bear that out. We have to keep monitoring it. At the same time, that is not to say that there is a reason to give carte blanche to all farmers in the country to ignore the genuine science-based rules that are there in order to improve things. So let's take the heat out of it a little bit, Stella. And are we trying to prove a point here? Are we trying to have an argument, or are we trying to solve a problem? I think we should be trying to solve a problem if there is one.
Just on that point, do you think then, I suppose, if farmers are getting exasperated, but do you think that this tightening as such of nitrates rules and things that might make it a bit more attractive to have like a housed system for dairy farming in Ireland?
Good question. I don't really think so. If the housed system in Ireland was attractive from a profitability point of view, if it was attractive from a lifestyle point of view, if it was attractive from an animal welfare point of view, there's a genuine question. Why haven't the most profitable and the leading dairy farmers in the country jumped all over it 20 years ago?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So the people we know that are really, really, and I'm talking about, people that are in their 70s at this stage and into their 80s that know dairy farming inside out and back to front and better than I ever will, they've stuck to the grass-based system. Are they mugs? I don't think so. Are some people going to sleepwalk into a confinement system in their circumstances? Possibly they will. Other people will plan to do it, and that's their decision. I am not saying that anybody that's in an indoor confined system is a mug by any means. There's some people are running that system and it works very well for them. And it's a very different ball game. And, we see it, and you have to be impressed by the performance in some of those systems. At the same time, for your sort of standard scale of operator, and scale comes into this a lot, for your land fragmentation and the issues of sort of the average scale of dairy farmers in the country, that grass-based system still remains the thing that gives you the best margin for your time, for your capital outlay, for your land resource. It does, and as I say, the best farmers that I would have seen, they've voted with their feet on that question over time. That's not to say that there isn't a niche that goes the other way, but I would just one final point on that, and it's something I've seen a lot looking at different parts of the country. The system that sort of returns the best returns on average tends to be that grass-based type system. If the grass-based system goes slightly wrong, you'll have a low margin and you'll have a bit of extra work. If an indoor system goes wrong, you'll have no margin and a lot of extra work. So the risk reward favors that retention of the system that we have. Okay. But again, I have to say, I'm always impressed by the best of what does them in a confinement system. And I shouldn't say it, but sometimes you'd be thinking, rather you than me, because they're doing their attention to detail is possibly beyond what a lot of us can achieve, I would say.
And finally, just before you go, Joe, I just want to ask you about the whole organic side of things. Would you say maybe in terms of dairy farming, like dairy farmers are getting a little left behind in the organic side of things, or do you think that they're embracing it more?
I don't think anyone's getting left behind. I think the organic incentives and the organic scheme is there for anyone who wishes to, who anyone's investigated, avail of it. It's there, and the supports are there. Like we have, from a Teagasc perspective, we have a very good resource. Like Joe Gallagher on the Teagasc side is running organic dairy discussion groups, and Joe was a very, very good dairy advisor in his own right for years. And I think that's actually an interesting point, to be honest, that first of all, what you have to be is a very, very good dairy farmer. And then you become a very good organic farmer, rather than, falling into an organic system or any alternative system because the system you're in already didn't suit you. And, the best organic dairy farmers we've seen have been excellent in their own right in a more conventional system. So the support is there, and we speak to to that side of the house inside Teagasc from on a fairly regular basis, and the demand is not coming through, possibly, Stella, to the same extent as it would be on the dry stock side. Is that a deficiency in the organic system or the organic program? It's probably not. It's probably more of a reflection, to be honest, of the fact that margins in the dairy system over the last number of years have been quite healthy, and the incentive to look at something different maybe hasn't been there, right? We're talking about organic dairy farmer numbers are in the dozens at this stage. There's 60 to 80, I suppose, or thereabouts. And there are push-pull factors, I suppose, in this. With relatively high margins last year, there was relatively few people were looking at the change. I can understand why maybe less intensively stocked enterprises, maybe a dry stock enterprise, for example, or a different enterprise, or some of the cropping enterprises might decide that they want to look at this as a new venture, if you like, or as a new challenge on their farm. But it really depends on where you're starting from. So, it's possibly because of that reason. But I would say that the supports are there. The messages around sort of cow type grazing management, the use of alternative crops or alternative swards are all there to be availed of for any dairy farmer that wants to try their hand at organics. We'll give them a hand at having a go at it too. But, it's really down to a demand question, I would say.
Well, that's all we have time for on the AgriFocus podcast today. Thank you to our guest, Dr. Joe Patton, Head of Dairy Knowledge Transfer with Teagasc. Please rate and review the AgriFocus podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, and do share it with anyone you think might be interested. Until next time, take care.